Hi, great to have you back for another video from AutoRJ.nl 2020. Look, 2025. It's going to be a good year for Fiat Panda fans. Fiat is introducing not one, but two new Pandas. A big and a small Panda. The small Panda is called the Pandina, and it's basically just the current Fiat Panda that you've been seeing driving around in the Netherlands for 15 years. Only with a small update and a new name, Pandina. But other than that, there's not much new about it. The big news is in the big Panda that we're driving today, the Grande Panda. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this car. I'm going to show you the inside and the outside. I'm going to tell you the specifications, and I'm going to tell you how it drives. So how big is this Grande Panda then? Well, it's 3 meters and 99 centimeters long, almost 4 meters long, and that doesn't make it gigantic, not enormously big, but it is definitely a size bigger than the normal Panda that you've been seeing driving around in the Netherlands for years, and it is definitely a good bit bigger than the original Panda from the 80s. It shares its base with the Citroën C3. You can see that car as its technical sibling. That car also uses the same platform as this one, the so-called smart car platform. That platform is from Stellantis. You might have heard of it before. That's the parent company of Citroën and Fiat, but also brands like Opel, Alfa Romeo, DS, Lancia, Abarth, and so on. And this platform is suitable for multiple types of drivetrains. You can get this car with a gasoline engine, but also with electric drive. If you choose the gasoline version, you'll always get under the hood a 1.2 3-cylinder gasoline engine. That's good for 100 horsepower. There's also a small electric motor under the hood then. That's good for 28 horsepower. When those engines work together, you have a total system power of 100 horsepower again. Today, we're driving the electric variant, the Grande Panda E. Here you'll always find under the hood, because the electric motor is located on the front axle and drives the front wheels. An electric motor that's good for 113 horsepower. As a result, this car goes from 0 to 100 in 11 seconds. And it has a top speed of 132 kilometers per hour. So not a very high top speed, but in the Netherlands, that should be enough, of course. As long as you stick to the speed limit. And going from 0 to 100 in 11 seconds isn't super fast, but it's not slow either. I'll just stop the car. Brake pedal in, gas pedal in, and off we go. You do get pushed back a bit in your seat. Of course, it's not hundreds of horsepower that you're working with, but this feels fast enough. And definitely when you're driving a bit faster, for example at 80 kilometers per hour and you want to overtake someone quickly, then everything goes quickly. Enough. This electric Grande Panda has a battery pack in the floor with a capacity of 44 kWh. With that, this car has a range of 320 kilometers on paper. In practice, there's always a bit less left over, of course, but I have to say we drove away today with this car with a fully charged battery. And then it showed just under 300 kilometers. I believe it was 295. And we've been on the road for an hour and a half now. I have now drained the battery down to 57%, and it now shows 130 kilometers. That's actually quite decent. We didn't hold back. And besides, we're driving in the mountains. Yeah, not right now, but we left the area and are driving a bit around the terrain through the mountains. In that regard, I don't think it's too bad. Although I can't read the consumption, we can't access that. I checked on that, but it will be available later. So you can also see what the power consumption is of this car, but so far it looks pretty good. Of course, 320 kilometers isn't a huge range, but the average Dutch person who drives 30, maximum 40 kilometers a day, so you should be just fine with that. Especially if this is a second car for you. Do you want to use this car? Also for going on vacation to Italy, for example, it becomes a bit of a different story. This car can fast charge at 100 kilowatts, which is quite decent, and also somewhat in line with the market for cars in this segment. But you'll need about 27 minutes for that to charge from 20 to 80%. If that's not fast enough for you and you want to cover longer distances on vacation, then you should definitely go for that mild hybrid drive. Home charging, it can do that too. It can do that up to 11 kilowatts, unless you choose a very special option. You can also get this car with a charging cable, and that's built into the car. That's the kind of curly cable. You can pull it out from the front. They did that very nicely. A bit like pulling a cord out of a vacuum cleaner, for example. And this way we can also push it back into the car. They really thought that through, very cleverly made up, and with that, they are actually the first car manufacturer in the world to offer such an option. And this is actually an option that people have been waiting for. By the way, it's not an option. You get it standard with the car, but it's definitely something that people are waiting for, I think, because the downside of charging cables is mainly that they always end up in a puddle, in a mud puddle or in a rain puddle, and then those cables get dirty and you put them in your trunk, and then your trunk is dirty, and especially after a year, your trunk is just one big mess. And especially after a year, your trunk is just one big mess. But in this car, you don't have to deal with that because the cable always hangs between the car and the charging station. And I just mentioned, this car is almost 4 meters long. Just as long as the Citroën C3. This car is just a bit more practical. It has a bit more luggage space. It has 361 liters of luggage space in the back. That's about 50 liters more than in the Citroën. And it's quite a lot of luggage space for a car in this segment. It also has more luggage space than, for example, a Renault 5. What really is a competitor to this car? Because that Renault 5 is also, just like this car, inspired by a car from the 80s. On the other hand, the seating space in the second row is less compared to the Citroën. Compared to the Renault 5, you can sit better in the back seat of this car, because in the Renault 5, it's pretty cramped in the back. But back here, you still sit quite comfortably in this Fiat, even if you're an adult. And then we also need to talk about the design of this car. I just mentioned the Renault 5. That car is inspired by the Renault 5 from the 70s and 80s. The Sank and the Super Sank. This Fiat is clearly inspired by the Fiat Panda from the 80s. It was introduced in 1980 with a lot of angular shapes. Back then, out of poverty, because they simply didn't have the money to bring a more creatively designed car to market, that's why that car was huge. Simple. Everything was square and could be easily assembled in the factory. And this car is also designed in a very square shape. Just look at the front of this car. Look at the headlights. Enormously square, but this time with special lighting, a kind of pixel lighting. It kind of reminds you of the Ioniq models from Hyundai. Those pixels in the headlights and also in the grille, they're a nod to the Lingotto. The Lingotto is the old Fiat factory where the Tipolino and the old 500 used to be made. And there are those big windows in it, those windows from the 1920s of the last century. Just think of the Van Nelle factory or the Swings factory in Maastricht. That's what the Lingotto looks like. And they've incorporated those windows into the grille and the headlights of this car. The back also strongly resembles the old Fiat Panda. You can find those windows there again, those square elongated pixels in the taillights. But the taillights themselves also have the shape of the old Fiat Panda, at least the taillights of the old Fiat Panda, of those elongated taillights. And if you ask me, this car is very well done. Just like the Renault 5, actually, it's a really nice car to look at. A cheerful sight, and a car that just gets a lot of thumbs up. When you drive around in this car, you can really tell that people are staring at it, and every now and then you also give a thumbs up. The dashboard also somewhat resembles the old Panda. For example, up here on the dashboard, you have a glove compartment, like the old Panda. Down here, by the way, you also have a regular glove compartment. The dashboard is also a bit of a nod to that Lingotto. I just mentioned the Lingotto up there. That factory has a large test track. That's where all the cars that came out of the factory were tested back in the day. They were slowly driven up there, and they were allowed to take a few laps to test if everything was working. And that track, it's an oval track. You could call it a kind of NASCAR track, an oval track. And that shape, the shape of an oval, can also be found in the dashboard. So the framing of the dashboard is oval shaped, but also the framing of the instrument panel, the screens that you have right in front of you, are also oval shaped. A nice nod to the Lingotto. Then the screens that I have right in front of me actually come standard. You don't have to pay extra for that. And besides that, you also get a whole bunch of physical buttons here in the middle. We all know those buttons from the Citroën C3, and they're very easy to use. The seats are also a big nod to the old Fiat Panda. With all these blocks that are integrated into the seats, the old Panda had that too. And you'll also find a lot of nods to the past on the outside of the car. Actually, it's too much to mention all of it. Take, for example, the Panda that's stamped on the side of the car. That's another nod to the old Panda 404. And the driving behavior of this car is very similar to that of the Citroën C3. That shouldn't come as a surprise. It's a bit less comfortable. The C3 has hydraulic bump, stops on the strut, which makes it extra comfortable. But this car is also quite comfortable. Actually, more comfortable than you'd expect from a car in this segment. You definitely notice that it handles speed bumps very well. You can occasionally feel the rear axle clattering, but it shouldn't really have a name. It's a bit more tightly damped, or maybe a bit harder damped. A bit stiffer sprung maybe than the Citroën, but that shouldn't really have a name. It's really a pleasant car to drive. A more mature car than you'd expect for a car in this segment. Not as mature maybe as the Renault 5. It also has a somewhat more complex suspension. Definitely at the back. That's also a somewhat more expensive car. We have to be honest about that, but overall it's a really nice car to drive. The steering is nice too, not too light. Often that's what happens with Fiat models. Think of the Fiat 500, where you really have almost no feel in the steering. With this car, everything is actually much better. Then we end this video with the prices. The Grande Panda starts at 25,990 euros, and that price actually applies to both powertrains. So both for the petrol version, or actually the multi-hybrid version, and also for this electric drive. So there's no price difference there. Of course, you can dress the car up, dressing it up thicker. The base version is the red trim. It's already quite well equipped with things like air conditioning, cruise control, and parking sensors at the back. But the slightly fancier version has more features, of course. That's the top version. It also has parking sensors at the front, and also a rear view camera, for example, and more of those kinds of luxury items. Also 17-inch wheels, because you get 16-inch wheels as standard. And yes, that's it already. The first short impression of the Fiat Grande Panda. Soon in the Netherlands, we'll be able to drive it a bit longer, and we can tell you a bit more about, among other things, the real-world fuel consumption of this car. Then you definitely don't want to miss a video from Autorit.nl, so don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Did you like this video? Then be sure to give it a thumbs up, and I hope to see you in the next video.